Welcome back. This is Unit 10 in the lecture series, and I'm currently calling it Life in the Non-Physical. I have no idea what the final name will be, what the final title will be. As you may know, this is sort of a first pass, first run, draft version of the lecture series, so I'm still working out kinks. I am really trying to say a little less often, if possible. That's pretty difficult for me, but I'm going to try. Hopefully it doesn't completely slow me down and make me turn me into a robot, but try to do a little bit less umming as we go. We're going to start this unit talking about shamanic journeying, and then we're going to get into past lives, hypnotic regression, and life between lives. And things get very interesting in life between lives as things progress here in this series of lectures. I have a feeling things are going to get harder and harder to swallow. I'll try to keep that from happening, but there's only so much I can do. Let's dive in. Shamanic journeying. Well, so this starts with something called a shaman, and most people have in their minds a picture of a shaman, and it's usually a Native American type of person. It involves feathers and headdresses and rattles and drums and things of that sort. And those stereotypes are not far off, although there are a lot of modern day shamans who aren't quite as costumed as those images that come to mind. The basic idea is true that there are a lot of accoutrements that go along very often with shamanic practices, and we'll describe those as we go along. This is a very ancient practice. This is probably what might be considered some of the earliest religious practices there are. Most historians, anthropologists believe that shamanic practices go back at least 10,000 years, probably more like 20 or 30,000 years. So really, as long as man has been a social creature, shamanic practices have existed. Most scientists, scientific thinkers, myself included, up until recently, have looked at shamanism really no differently than most religious practices. I've looked at it in terms of very superstitious, based on superstition and based on ignorance of how the world works. That's really what I felt was the root of all of this, and maybe it is the root of it, but here's the thing that I never gave much thought to. If shamanic practices, if they were ineffective and it was all just a bunch of fear and ignorance, then shamans in general would be not very valuable to their groups, to their tribes. And that's not really the way it's really worked out. In most ancient societies, most tribal structures, shamans have been a very, very important part of the structure of the tribe and of the group for thousands of years. And the question is, if they were ineffective and ineffectual, how would they maintain that status? And I don't have a good answer for that. That's really the conundrum here. If it was just a bunch of BS, then they would have been proven to be not a very valuable contributing member to their society long ago, and probably would have been discarded by the society as being useless. That didn't happen. So you've got to think that perhaps there's some deeper story here. in terms of what they're connecting to and what they're doing and how effective they are. So that I didn't really look at shamanism that seriously early on in my journey, but over time it really felt to me like something I should take a closer look at. So let's talk about what shamanic practices are. First of all, almost no one refers to themselves as a shaman. That's a real honor to be considered a shaman. And shamanic practitioners, or one of the sort of traits of these people, is great humility. And that humility is because, first of all, it's just typically the type of person who does these things. That's just their typical makeup, is being humble. But also, there's a whole sort of belief in shamanic practices that arrogance will lead to the shamanic powers being taken away from you. Shamans believe that are higher intelligences that they work with, and these higher intelligences choose whether to work with a particular practitioner and choose how much to work with them, etc. And so approaching these intelligences in a more humble way seems to be the way to encourage these intelligences to work with them. So you don't find people taking out front page ads saying that they're claiming that they're a shaman. Even the most effective, well-known shamans in the world don't refer to themselves as a shaman. They refer to themselves as a shamanic practitioner. Just a little detail. Shamanic practice, what is it about? Well, what it's about is it's about a belief that in the non-physical aspect of our world, and we've spent a lot of time talking about this, about the non-physical aspect of our reality, and so there should be no surprises there. And these are some of the earliest people to recognize that there was this aspect of our world. And shamanic practice is very interesting because it's not about praying to a deity. It's about working with various aspects, various entities within the non-physical environment to solve problems here in reality. So the way shamanic practice works is you will have someone who is sick or has a problem of some sort, and these problems could be physical problems, they could be mental problems, they could be a farmer that's not getting enough rain, it could be any number of different sorts of problems that need to be solved. And what happens is the shamanic practitioner goes into a trance and transitions to the non-physical in an out-of-body like way, and has this out-of-body experience in the non-physical space. But while that practitioner goes to the non-physical space, they work with spirit guides of various different types to solve various problems and bring information back, bring healing information back, bring instructions back to the person who is looking to solve the problem. So it's all about, this is really considered a healing practice in many regards. So a lot of the kinds of problems that are being solved are health related kinds of problems. And so the practitioner learns about the problem, goes to the non-physical, works with guides of various types, and very often these guides take the form of animals, referred to as power animals. And we work with these animals and work with these guides. They get information, get instructions, come back and implement those instructions. So in a very real sense, they're a medium in a way, because they serve as an intermediary. They get information, they go over, they come back with answers. How does it work? Well, the way it works is there are a lot of rituals that they go through, and very often those rituals involve things like rhythmic drumming or rhythmic sounds that you make, even rhythmic breathing, physical rhythmic processes. And the idea is, and I assume that anthropologists and maybe psychologists have studied this and figured this out, is that this sort of rhythmic nature of beating on that drum and hearing that sound over and over and over again sort of gets you into a receptive state, physiologically and psychologically into a receptive state, so that you can enter that astral plane. And as we talked about in, I think it was the previous unit, it may have been 2 units ago, we were talking about out-of-body experiences, and we were talking about the different methods that you can use to be able to separate from your body. And we talked about various hallucinogens, and we talked about meditation, and we talked about brain synchronization through hemisync. Well, this really is another way to accomplish that. But as I said, the difference here with shamanic practices is real work gets done in the non-physical space. This is not a general exploration. This is where real work gets done. It gets a little bit stranger, believe it or not, than simply leaving your body and going into the non-physical space to try to get answers. They also talk about shape-shifting. So they're also talking about taking the form of various types of animals in this process. And I'm talking about in this physical space. Shamanic practitioners historically have said that they're able to take the form or join with the form of a hawk or a lion or some animal to be able to gain different insight on the world. So there's not only this idea of separating from your physical body and moving into the non-physical space and getting answers. There's also the idea of being able to separate from your physical body and joining with another physical body in this reality. And as I said, perhaps it's an eagle or a hawk or a fish or an antelope or some other animal. So those are the kinds of things that shamanic practitioners talk about being able to do. I am unaware that there's been a lot of work and research in validating the idea that someone could actually shapeshift. I'm not sure that any real work has been done in that regard, but those are the claims that are made. There have been a lot of books, as you might imagine, that have been written on shamanic practices, so there's lots of information out there. There's not only information about how shamanism works, there's information about how to train to become a shaman. And very often that's done by working with a shaman in an apprentice kind of a role. So that's what shamanic journeying is. That's what the process is, and those are the reasons for doing it. I have been working in shamanic practices for some time. I have not had any deep insights or results that come from it. But I've also been working in lots of different directions on lots of different techniques and lots of different methodologies and approaches, and shamanism is simply one. I have a feeling that I would be probably more effective at any one of these things if I were to pay attention to one of these things for a long period of time and really hone my skills. And eventually I'd like to do that. But I really feel drawn at this time to get familiar with the range of possibilities, understand the range of possibilities, how they may or may not work, and just try to understand how all the pieces fit and what the overall puzzle looks like before really diving in and really trying to become proficient in one area. I would absolutely love to be proficient in the shamanic arts, and maybe someday I'll get there. But for now, I do have some experience with it. I have had some training in it. I do participate in shamanic ceremonies even to this day. Things like sweat lodges, for example, which are a part of the Native American tradition. and other kinds of shamanic practices, smudging and other sorts of things. And so I still do participate in these practices, but I really, as I said, have not become proficient in any significant way. So that's what shamanic journeying is all about. There's a few books that'll be referenced in our material. One particular book is it reads like a novel, but it's not a novel. It's actually it's a work of nonfiction. And it's written by a gentleman named Hank Wesselman. He's an anthropologist, and he travels around the world studying anthropological sites. And he accidentally stumbled upon some very, very odd behaviors and occurrences that happened to him. And they continued to have, it's sort of a Robert Monroe type of a story where one night he started to have some strange experiences. A few months later, he had more strange experiences, and a few months later, he had more strange experiences. And the more times this occurred, the more time it piqued his interest, the more he looked into it, the more he experimented and studied, and eventually he became a very, very adept at the shamanic practices. And the story is rather incredible, and I'll talk a little bit more about him, I believe, in the next unit, so I won't go into it any further than that. But I would highly recommend his book, Spirit Walker, for those who are curious. And as I said, I'll talk about that later, some more in another unit. So that's what shamanic journeying is. I'm not going to bother getting into stories about it because we have too much material to cover, and I don't consider this one of the core pieces of material that I want to spend a lot of time on. The next topic is past lives. There's a Dr. Raymond Moody, who really is the father of this whole topic. And he is a trained psychologist, I believe, and he wrote a book called Life After Life. What makes Raymond Moody special is the idea of hypnotic regression. And what he found was that in regressing patients who have various kinds of problems, he discovered that he could, and this is just a fact of regression, is that you could hypnotize someone and you can take them back so that they can recount some aspect of their life in a bit more detail and a bit more clarity than they would otherwise be able to. And it allows you to be able to get at psychological injuries and basically provide counseling and support and help them resolve issues in their life. It might be that they're afraid of water, or they're hate their mother, or whatever it might be. And hypnotic regression allows you to get back to the root cause of some of these problems, help you identify those things, discuss those things, bring them out into the open, and resolve those issues so that people can heal. So that's what it's all about. What Raymond Moody discovered was, as he was regressing these people back, he could actually regress them back to the point where they were born. And what he found was, if he could go further back and reach other lives. I mean, so he could, obviously reincarnation is all about the idea that people have multiple lives, but this was the first time that in a clinical setting, people have discovered that individuals not only have the ability to be able to regress their memory back to their own birth. Literally, some people can actually recall the process of being born, being in the birth canal, being in their mother's womb, even. And sometimes there's vertical information that they can discover that can prove the accuracy of what they're saying. But he found further that he was able to regress people to previous lives and allow people to go back to those previous lives and discover things about things that they had done in completely other lives. Why would you need to do that? Well, so he very often worked with people that had problems that very often manifested themselves actually as physical problems. Chronic problems with an elbow or an arm, or chronic problems with some chronic health problems that there didn't seem to be any root cause that he could identify. Maybe a pain, in a certain part of the chest that was just this recurring pain over years, and there didn't seem to be any root cause for it. And then in a particular case like that comes to mind, he was regressing his person back to find out the root cause of this pain, and what he found was in a previous life, this person did recall being a warrior of some sort, and this person recalled all the details of being, of fighting battles, and the type of dress and the type of food they had, and the type of surroundings, the type of architecture. I mean, they were able to recall a lot of detail about their previous life, and in this particular case, they recalled how they died in some previous life. It may have not been the particular life that directly preceded their current life. It may have been further back than that. But in this particular case, they died because they received a spear to the chest. And in these particular situations, often if the patient realizes where that pain is coming from, they realize the root cause, and they expose it and discuss it, what very often ends up happening is that the pain ends up going away, or the other health problem ends up disappearing once the patient kind of understands the root cause of the health problem. There have been other cases where patients have had, excessive and really unexplained, say, fear of water. And by going through this regression process, they were able to find out that, in a previous life, certain things happened, and that's why they're afraid of the water. And that, again, once they knew that, they were able to resolve that issue and put those issues behind them. I've actually had a regression myself, and took me back to a previous life in a much more very primitive environment. I really have no idea. It's a very tribal, sort of primitive kind of environment that I experienced. I saw my family, my wife, my children, the other people in my village. I can describe the construction of the huts in that village. I know what my overall life was about. I recalled certain major events in that lifetime. I know how I died in that life. The problem is when all was said and done in that regression, and I came out of it. Once you come out of it, you can remember all the things that occurred during the regression. The problem is, for me, and apparently this is true for people who are sort of left brain oriented and sort of logical thinkers, that it all felt like I was making it up. It all felt like it felt like a process of imagination as I was being asked, well, what about this and what about that? I sort of felt like I was creating the story from my imagination as I was talking. And even to this day, I'm not so sure that I fully buy into it. However, people who are wired differently and have different psychological makeup, and maybe, who knows, maybe even some sort of a neurophysiological makeup, really felt like this is very real. When they were regressed back into this other life, there's no doubt in their mind that was real, and that was them, and those are real experiences that they were experiencing. So, I guess I wanted people to understand that there is this thing called past life regression. There are clinical psychologists, I believe, are people who do these, who perform these hypnotic regressions. They're certified in all states in the country, and this is something that anybody can do. So whether it's just out of curiosity, which is what it was for me, or whether there are issues that you believe that you've got this unexplained fear of whatever, or you've got other kinds of maybe even health issues or other kinds of issues that you think that this may help you uncover the cause, I'd recommend it. These sessions cost anywhere between 90 and say $150. They last for a couple of hours to 3 or even 4 hours. They typically what these things, the way they work is you do a short regression for maybe an hour to kind of get used to the process and used to the doctor and used to the whole thing, and then you maybe come back if you want a few weeks later to do a full regression, which is a multi-hour kind of process. So that's the way it works. I will give some links in the back of this in the handout document in the resources guide, so that people can find people who do this work, and you can see if it works for you. If nothing else, it's like getting a reading from a medium, only a lot more personal and a lot more detailed. And the interesting thing is, if this works for you, it isn't about someone telling you about you or about loved ones in the afterlife who want to communicate with you. It's about being able to tune in to a different life, and you actually are transported into that life, and you're actually experiencing that life. You're experiencing the sights and the sounds and the people and the language and the clothes and everything. You're really having that experience. It's pretty extraordinary, and I've read several books on it, again, that I will direct you to if you're interested, so you can read some of these stories and some of the impact that it's made on people who have had these regressions. Very, very interesting stuff. So that's what past life work is about, and as I said, Raymond Moody is the go-to guy for information on that. So you really need to read, if you're interested in this, read Life After Life by Raymond Moody to get the details, and you'll see a link in the document that I'll provide. So there was this guy, we're going to move on to the next chapter here. There was this gentleman named Michael Newton who was doing this regression work based on the Raymond Moody protocol, if you want to refer to it as that. And what he found was, one time by accident, as he was regressing someone back, but the way this works is you regress back to when you're born, and then you kind of make a leap back through this. There's a little process that they go through where they have you sort of imagine that you're standing there, and you look down at your feet and you see what you're wearing for shoes, and then you see what you're wearing for clothes, and little by little you're sort of transported into this environment from the previous life. Well, this guy Michael Newton was doing this sort of work, and he discovered once that as he was regressing someone backward to their current birth of their current life, which is that's the first step in the process for the Raymond Moody process, what he found was he actually regressed back to just before the person was born. And they were talking about an environment and people and homes and a life that was not their current life, and it was not a previous life. It ended up being the life that they were living just before they were born. But this is a life that they were living in a non-physical environment. You can call it heaven if you want, if that's probably a nice, simple, easy word to use. They were recalling their life in heaven, which was pretty fantastical. And he ended up honing this process and specializing in specifically targeting, not regressing to past lives, but regressing to what he referred to as your life between lives. And I want to talk a little bit about that. This is not a new concept at all. I mean, the whole idea of heaven as a place and as a thing and as a lifestyle, if you want to put it that way, is something that's been around for, thousands of years. There's lots and lots of different ideas as to what this place is. There's some sort of, I guess I would call, uh, well, I shouldn't say whether they're invalid, but there are some sort of religious views of heaven that it's this very, very, boy, what? Not a, it's not a life per se. You're not there having a life, eating meals. It's a very, very idyllic thing that where you don't really have any activities. You're just sort of existing in this, at the hand of God, or at the right or the left hand of Jesus, or however it works out to be. But it almost feels like there's no point to it. It's just this idyllic existence that you're in after you live your life. And actually, if you talk to most priests, ministers, rabbis, whatever, you'll get all kinds of different views as to what happens after you live. But very often the description is A, you go there and that's where you stay forever, and B, there's nothing really that gets done there. It's just this, eternity in summertime, sort of hanging out and enjoying floating around in the clouds and listening to the music. So it doesn't really seem to be much of a point to it, and which kind of always felt to me to detract from whether or not it's really valid. I mean, how could that even really work? And would someone really want to spend eternity in this kind of a state? I mean, no matter how enjoyable the state would be, would you want to just sit there in that sort of state forever? Anyways, there's never been a lot of meat put on those bones. It's always just been a very vague kind of presentation of what heaven is. So but there's this other view of life between lives that is more coming from spiritual people, spiritual journeyers and practitioners, and it really talks more about going to this place after you die, and it may be a very pleasant place, and in that place you heal, you rest, you learn, and you plan. And so that just always felt to me to be maybe a more believable description of what happens, because it seems to have a point, right? You're actually doing something, you're accomplishing something. Anyways, that's always been what spiritual thinkers have purported. What Michael Newton discovered when he regressed people back to this stage, he took people that had no particular belief system in terms of what they may or may not be looking forward to when they die, and took people with that sort of neutral view of things and regressed them back, and found that when they ended up finding themselves in this space, they described very, very similar things from one person to the next to the next. So if he did 100 of these regressions, he ended up getting very, very consistent stories from people as to the things that they described. So here's what they describe in general. It's kind of like the near-death experience or the death experience. Everyone kind of describes similar thing. They describe a tunnel. They describe a light. They describe being met by someone at the light, etc., etc. So if you take 100 of these near-death experiences, you'll get all kinds of flavors of situations that have occurred, but there's a lot of common threads that always seem to pop up. Well, the same is true with life between lives. And here's the basic idea that comes out of this. And this is as described by people who were hypnotically regressed into remembering what happened to them. So what happens is you die, you separate from your body, you go through the transition that we've already talked about into this heaven place. Hopefully you don't get stuck in some shell close to the physical. You move through that and you transition to, again, we'll just call it heaven. And so that's where the life between lives gets now can be discussed, because now you're in that space where you're having your life between lives. First of all, you're not going there and arriving and figuring out what it's all about when you get there. That's not the way it works. You're going there and arriving, and when you get there, you are really returning home. That is actually what you consider your home. The people who incarnate and have a life here on earth, it turns out that they consider this to be the carnival ride, the temporary experience, the learning experience, however you want to put it. This is not their home. This is the place they came to do certain work, to learn certain things, to grow in certain ways, to have certain experiences. And then they return back home. So this is the vacation that they were taking. Think of it as a working vacation. And so these people realized when they were regressed that they're not dying and going to this odd place. They are dying and returning home from whence they came. Right? They came here and now they're returning home. So they get home, and the first thing that happens when they get home is they just get reacquainted with all of their companions back there. Okay, who are their companions? Well, there's a couple of different ways to describe the companions that you're going to reacquaint yourself with. First of all, there's just family. So there's your grandparents, there's your parents, there's your friends, whatever, people in your life that have passed on. Very often, especially if you've got a close relationship with them, very often those are the people that will be meeting you there and that will sort of be welcoming you back. There's another group of people, though, that in many ways are more important than those people that you just happen to live with while you're here in your working vacation, which you call your life. And that's your soul group. And this is a very, very, very consistent part of the story, that almost all people who are regressed to their life between lives, they recount this. There's some number of other souls that they have been with for eons, who knows how many thousands of years. And the number is variable, but it's probably more than 5, and it's probably less than 20. It's that kind of a number. And these are people who you have been with for a very, very, very long time. These are people that have accompanied you in your life experiences, and you've accompanied them in their life experiences many times. You may have a soul group member that was your mother in some life, and was your brother in a different life, and was your tormentor in a different life. So these aren't necessarily people that you loved in your life. But they are people who played an important role in your life. Anyways, we'll move on from that, and we'll get to more of the logistics. So you're going back, you're meeting these family members, which may or may not be your soul group, and you're getting reacquainted and reintegrated with the members of your soul group. And there are various things that go on in this world, in this environment when you get back. And I've already talked about some of these things, and that's what makes some of the work that I've done so interesting, because the threads tie together very nicely. One of the things that these people recount was being told in the channel book that I was talking about. I think was in the last unit, where there's this sort of hospital or recuperation ward that a lot of people end up going to if they have a lot of psychic injuries. That kind of a process has also been described by many of these people who regressed back into their life between lives. And remember, a lot of these people who were regressed to their life between lives have no religious axe to grind. They don't have any background in metaphysics or spirituality. They've never had any concept of this idea that there's this healing place that you go to in heaven. So it's not like this is a part of our culture and that these people would simply have inherited that from culture or from movies or from books. Because unless you're really into spiritual journeying and you're reading all these books, and you're not getting this information. And there's certainly not much out there in terms of movies in this subject matter. So, anyways, these people are recounting these similar stories without any reason to know this information. So there's this place of healing. That's one thing that they describe. There's this other thing that they all describe, which is a past life review. And it's a process where they work with their spirit guides. I believe your soul group you're really amongst peers who are at a very similar level of development. And you're all sort of in the process of incarnating and reincarnating and integrating all that experience through those incarnations. Whereas your guides are really a level higher than that. And these are people who may not be in the process of incarnating anymore, or may have never incarnated at all in the first place. They're simply there to help guide you and help you. So there's really two levels here. You've got your soul group at one level, and then you've got guides at another level. And your guides are probably different than your friend and your soul group members, than the other members of your soul group. So you all have different guides. I know that this sounds strange, but I'm just going to tell you how it's recounted, and you can make your own decisions. So you get into this. It's literally a room where you've got various guides that are there with you, and they help you do a review of your life. And literally, it's been described as a screen. It's been described as other people as a glass dome. There's various different ways to sort of view your past life, but everything you've ever done, every significant event in your life, you can review. You can relive. It's apparently from the people who have been regressed and written books on this and talked about this. It's actually like reliving the event. And not only can you relive the event, but apparently there's the ability to relive an event in multiple different ways from multiple different perspectives and see what multiple different outcomes would have been if you had gone left instead of right, or if you had been nice to that person instead of mean to that person. What would that have done in terms of your overall life experience? You can actually play those games and do those what ifs. It's one of the things that you can do while you're in this heaven space, is kind of do that work. So you do a life review, and the idea of these guides are not there to judge you. You're there to see what you did, and you can decide whether the things you did and the things that you said, whether the way that you acted were in everyone's best interest or not, and perhaps learn lessons from the things that you did. If there's any judging going on, you're judging yourself. So once you get through the healing part of the process, and you get through the life review part of the process, there's a whole life that goes on there. There are homes, and if you want, there are jobs, there are hobbies, there are all kinds of experiences that you can participate in this space. And the sense that I'm getting from a lot of the descriptions that I've seen on this space is that some of it's just for, rest and relaxation. It's just to sort of recharge the batteries. There's a certain amount of, you went off and you did this hard work during this previous life, and you busted your hump for 40 years, and you raised 3 kids, and you did, you had good times and you had bad times. But basically, this is your chance to just sort of take a deep breath and relax and enjoy and be happy. There's no mortgage to pay. There's very little in terms of those kinds of responsibilities. It's more about just personal happiness and growth. So there's a bunch of sort of R&R that's going on in this process. And as I said, there's also the ability to be able to experiment a little bit with your previous lives, and what if I had done this versus that? What if I had finished what if I had stayed at this job, or what if I had married that person instead of this person. You can do all these sorts of play all these sorts of games, so that you can kind of gain experience and wisdom through that process. Keep in mind, if this is all true and if you've really lived all of these different lives with these soul group members, when you get back into this space, you are not just the accumulated experience of what happened in this life. You are the accumulated experience of what happened in this life and all previous lives and all previous life between lives. So you are the total sum of the experience from all the different incarnations you've had, plus all the different things you've done in heaven, if you want to call it heaven. So you're a much larger being with much more in terms of experiences than you give yourself credit for. As a matter of fact, the way I've heard it said by people who have been regressed, people who have written and read channeled books, is that you are, in some ways, considered the creme de la creme. Anyone who's here on this earth, even if you're a homeless person living under a bridge, you are the upper crust of entities that have just, because you have chosen to come to earth, which is a very, very difficult place to be, to grow and to experience things. Apparently, there are a lot of entities that are in the non-physical now who don't have the interest, the ability, the strength to be able to put up with what people put up with to come to earth. So there are some people who say that you are already a magnificent and powerful being. Even the most lowly person on earth is a fantastically powerful, creative being, and to have come to earth to begin with. I've read that in many cases and many different situations. So you got the R&R aspect of it, and over time, you end up being recuperated and recharged and ready to go at it again. And at some point, you end up spending time with soul group members planning your next adventure and planning the things that you need to learn next, and also participating in your soul group members in their plans for what they need to do next. Perhaps you're just spending time doing R&R and just sort of trying to get your wits about you and recharge your batteries, but you have a soul group member who is thinking about reincarnating, and perhaps you sit down with that soul group member and talk about what their plans are and what they want to learn and how they might accomplish that. So this sounds awfully strange, but there's this whole, and this has been described many times by many people, this whole process of literally sitting down and planning out the details of what a life should be. Perhaps this person had a very, very hard life financially, or maybe they were abused, or whatever it might be, and maybe it's like, what, now I want to see what it's like to have everything I ever wanted. Or maybe I was a man and now I want to be a woman. Maybe I was abused and now I need to be the abuser. Because maybe I need to see why and how that person could have abused me. How does that work? And maybe the only way to find that out is to actually play the part of the abuser. And again, I know this maybe sound hard to take, but I've read pieces about people who have been abused who decide they need to be the abuser, and often they will have a contract. I always hear the term contract used when it comes to life planning. They'll have a contract with another soul group member that other soul group member will be their abuser. And of course, who would ever want to abuse someone that they love dearly and that they've been with for eons? But these are the kinds of things that you will do to help your soul group member grow and learn the lessons they need to learn. So perhaps some of the awful people who have lived in this world were doing those things as part of an agreement to help another person or to help the world in general learn some lesson. Perhaps that's what Hitler was. Perhaps Hitler served an invaluable role in the growth of mankind, humankind. Impossible to say. Maybe it's not impossible to say. I can't really say. And I'm not claiming that that's the situation. All I'm trying to say is that there's lots and lots and lots of examples of people who have been through this kind of life planning process, who have described the process in this way. And then eventually what will happen is you will have a set of ideas as to what you want to learn in a life, and you'll have basic milestones in the life and roles that will be played by people. For example, obviously your mother was always going to play an important role. Well, usually play an important role in your life. Perhaps your siblings, perhaps your wife or your lover or whatever, perhaps a boss. And so you're going to have important people enter your life at various times in your life and are going to help you learn the lessons that you need to learn or that you're trying to learn in your life. And so those people are not always going to be there for day one. So you may have a soul group member who's going to be a very important role in your life, who you're not going to meet until you're 50 years old, right? So there's even that sort of thing where, and the way it's been said is that occasionally you meet someone and you know instantly that that person is significant, and that person, you somehow click with that person, or you realize the significance of that person. That person ends up being, your best friend, or very, very important in your life for some reason. And the way it's described is, at some deep level, you recognize that person. You recognize that that's someone that you've known for a long time, and you recognize the importance they're going to play in this particular incarnation that you're living. So that kind of explains why you get those feelings occasionally, where you fall in love the first time you meet this person, right? You fell in love almost instantly. Well, the way that would be described is that you kind of knew at some deep level who that person was, and that's why that happened. Okay, so there's lots and lots of those sorts of ways of viewing it. Bottom line is you end up doing this work, you end up making these plans, and you end up creating what is very often referred to as life contracts. You're going to be my abuser. I'm going to be your son. I'm going to commit suicide at 10 years old or 20 years old, and I know how painful that's going to be for you, but that's a lesson that you want to learn. I will, this life is going to be about those 20 years for me, and then after that, I'm going to bail, and then you're going to learn those lessons, and you're going to move on in your life. And so all these agreements are referred to as life contracts. And there are people who specialize in these hypnotic regressions, and they sort of help you map out those contracts, and they help you figure out what those agreements are that you may have made for the life that you're living now. And although you're looking at your life as this train wreck, perhaps the things that have gone on in your life are exactly the kinds of things that you wanted to go on, even though you can't see that. Because, of course, there's this whole process of forgetfulness that, once you're incarnated and once you're born as a baby, you don't have those memories are wiped clean. Interesting, though, that the whole process of reincarnation, most reincarnation stories come from young kids, from 2 to, say, 7 or 8 years old. And after 7 or 8 years old, those memories fade. And as an adult, that person doesn't remember their previous life at all. But during those few years, from 2 years to, say, 7 or 8 years, some people actually remember a lot about their previous life. This actually fits very nicely with the whole idea that there are previous lives. There is this whole life planning process. You do lose the memory of that when you enter your new life, but in some cases you don't lose that memory immediately. It fades over time. And so by the time you get to be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, all those memories have faded. But if you pay attention to children during those early years, you may find that they do actually remember a lot of these things. Unfortunately, people that are that age are not really taken very seriously, and so the people don't really listen to them fantastic stories that they may tell. So you have these meetings, you have these planning sessions, you create these life contracts, and then you reincarnate. There are lots of stories about people choosing their parents. I know I could choose these parents or those parents or these parents. I could live in the Midwest. I could live in the Northeast. I really feel like for this life, I really need to live in this kind of area. And so I'm going to choose these parents. So it really is this whole crazy process of, saying, I know I could choose any one of these 6 or 8 different couples. I'm going to choose this one as my parents. There really are stories that recount it in that way. The last thing I guess I want to say about this whole thing is the idea of free will versus the fact that you have a plan. And one thing, and this is always discussed, and let's say the plan says that you're going to marry this particular person and you're going to have 2 kids and you're going to do all this stuff. Does that mean you have to marry that person? Does that mean the decisions you're making in your life aren't even really decisions at all? You're just kind of, working your way through something where all the major decisions have already been made? And the answer is no. The general consensus is your life is set up with certain milestones in it. You really should be marrying this person, and you're going to do these things, and you're going to take that job, and then this is going to happen. And maybe there's a dozen different sort of milestones in your life that are the big decisions that are going to be made, that need to be made in certain ways. But in fact, when you make your choices, I'm sorry, I'm dealing with my cat running around my feet, which is why I'm so distracted here. But when you make those big decisions, you're making those decisions with your own free will. So you may not marry that person that you were supposed to marry. You may marry someone else. So you go along with your life in a sort of not exactly the path that you were originally planning to take. You're taking this other path. But as I said, you have these 6 or 7 or 8 or however many milestones in your life. Perhaps that important boss that is supposed to be a part of your life does become a part of your life, and that person does end up being your boss. That person you're supposed to meet when you're 50 that serves as a mentor or a helper or a guide, or maybe even as a negative part of your life, but it was an important part of the plan. Maybe that still happens. So you have free will throughout your life, and you may or may not make the decisions that you had planned to make when you planned out your life to begin with. But in total, you typically will encounter those people, those soul group members that are meant to be a part of your life. Even if this decision or that decision is made differently, your life will maybe take a slightly different path, but you'll typically encounter some of those people along the way. And if you don't, you don't. When all is said and done and you die and you go back and do your life review, it's not like you're going to get 20 lashes because you made the wrong decisions and you didn't marry the right person, right? That's not the way it works. So at the end, you're going to do a life review, and you're going to decide whether you felt like you lived the life you wanted to live and whether you made the right, decisions as you went along, whether or not you made the choices that you planned to make, originally. Okay, so there you go. There's some of the detail of how all these pieces fit together and how the non-physical works. Not much in the way of stories this time, because there's a zillion possible stories. This was more really describing the logistical process of how this has been purported to be and how these things take place. I know that these things are hard to swallow for strict materialist, scientific, kinds of thinkers, but this is what's being said in the materials, and this is what people say who have had regressions back to their life between lives or back to their previous lives. These are the things that they have been saying. All right, so that's Unit 10. Unit 11 gets into more amazing things. Unit 11 is sort of a hodgepodge of interesting topics that I thought people ought to hear about. And I'll tell you what's in the unit. It talks about shared dreaming, end-of-life lucidity, the skull experiments, which are very interesting physical mediumship experiments that went on in England 30 or 40 years ago, plant consciousness, paired life experiences, and that's about it. So just to wet your whistle, those are the things we're going to talk about in Unit 11. And then in Unit 12, we're going to try to wrap it up with some, I think, important conclusions. Really pull all these pieces together and try to make sense of it all. All right, so until then, have a nice day.